back at the conference, how weak do you think Theresa May is after her conference speech?
Look, I think the problem for Theresa May was that she was in a weak position going into her conference speech. The conference speech itself shouldn't have made any great difference. She was unlucky. You know, every politician would have watched that speech thinking, oh my goodness.
But you think she's a weak leader?
Yes, I do.
And despite that, she was strong enough to say no to a second independence referendum to you.
Look, the SNP won the election in Scotland. The SNP is sitting right now in opinion polls, 17 points clear of her nearest
But what I'm saying
rivals.
is she's a weak leader, but she was strong enough to stand up to you and say no to a second independence referendum.
Well, I'm not quite sure what point you're making. So if Scotland wants to have a second independence referendum, I don't think it's for any Tory Prime Minister to stand in the way of that. I've set out the
So you would go ahead with that without a Section 30 order, perhaps?
I don't think that will happen in Scotland. I don't think that should happen in Scotland. The point I'm making is if there is to be a referendum in Scotland, we should do it the same way as we did it the last time, with the consent of two governments who don't agree on independence but nevertheless come together to agree a process. That's a shining example then, and it's one that I think should be an example not just in Scotland but to the rest of the world as well.
When I interviewed you in June, you said you thought another independence referendum was highly likely within the course of this Parliament. Do you still think that?
I've got a mandate for that, and given everything that's happening with the UK engulfed in chaos right now, with the looming disaster that I think Brexit could be, then the case for Scotland taking control of our own future into our own hands gets stronger by the day. But when you interviewed me in June, what you also had me say, because I just said it to Parliament, of course, was that I will not consider the precise timing of a referendum again until there is greater clarity on the Brexit situation. So I'm not going to contradict myself by immediately allowing you to take me into a speculative discussion about the timing of a referendum. I will, though, continue to make the case for Scotland being independent, because, as I've just said, I think that case gets stronger by the day.
But you stand by that? You still think it's highly likely in this Parliament?
I stand by the comments I've made, and let me just, for the sake of clarity, we have a mandate for this Parliament. We won that mandate last year. But after the general election, I heard clearly people saying that with the uncertainty of Brexit, it was premature to be definitive about a timescale right now. So I've said I won't consider the timescale until there is greater clarity about the Brexit talks. I'm not going to go any further than that. That's my position. But of course, I, the SNP, will continue to make the case for Scotland becoming an independent country, because Brexit shows it's the case for independence doesn't rest on Brexit, but Brexit is an illustration of what can happen to a country when we allow the decisions about our future to be taken elsewhere rather than being in our own hands.
But just to be absolutely clear, you still think it's highly likely in this Parliament?
Look, you can go around this in a whole load of different ways.
I'm just asking the same question. I'm not going around in any different way. Do you still think it's highly likely?
There is a mandate for that, but I will take the decisions about timing.
There is a mandate for that. We know that. We've all been through that election. But do you still think it's highly likely?
Colin, I will decide and make my judgment about the timing when there is greater clarity in Brexit. That's what I told Parliament I would do. That's what I'm going to do. It would be kind of contradictory for me to say I'm not going to just consider the timing until we have greater clarity in Brexit and then get into a precise discussion with you about the timing. I've just put your own words
back to you, saying it's highly likely in this Parliament.
I stand by what I've said.
So you still do think it's highly likely in this Parliament, and clearly if you stand by what you said.
I will consider the timing of a referendum when we've got greater clarity in Brexit. In the meantime, I will carry on building the case for Scotland to be an independent country.
How big a problem do you think no deal on Brexit would be for Scotland?
I think it would be a disaster for the whole of the UK, and Scotland included in that. To crash out of the European Union with no deal about a future trading relationship or all the other relationships that are required to allow life to carry on as it does, I think would be a disaster for the whole of the UK, and we've all got to hope that doesn't happen. What I think we need to see from the UK government is an approach that, yes, accepts we're leaving the EU. I regret that, but I accept it. But tries to get to a common sense position where we stay in the single market, stay in the customs union, because that's the best way to protect jobs and living standards.
Are there any positives at all that you can see in Brexit?
Look, you should always look for positives out of any situation, but I think the negatives of Brexit outweigh any positives you could possibly come up with. But I think I increasingly find in the discussions I have with businesses and others across the country, the fact that 15 months on, there is still not an iota of certainty about what that future relationship is going to be is what is causing increasing concern. And that's what's got to change. We've got to see a situation emerge where people, whatever the outcome is going to be, people get to to see what that is and start to prepare for it.
At the conference today, Derek Mackay, your finance secretary, is talking about lifting the public sector pay cap. Are you going to lift that to at least inflation?
I'm not going to negotiate.
Make it worthwhile?
Look, I'm not going to negotiate public sector pay.
I don't expect you to,
Yeah,
but presumably that's going to be a kind of a baseline is the inflation rate.
We will have discussions and negotiations with public sector unions in the normal course of events. We've said, and let's remember something quite important here, we're the only government in the UK right now that's given an unequivocal commitment to lift the 1% pay cap.
For all public sector workers?
For all public sector workers. And what we have said is that we need, it stands to reason, I'm not saying anything here that anybody can disagree with, we need pay rises to be affordable because we have to be able to pay for them, but we also want them to be fair and to recognise the real life circumstances of people in the public sector. Inflation is rising, and that's one of those real life circumstances I'm talking about. Beyond that, we have negotiations, public sector bodies have negotiations with different unions, and it's right to allow them to take their course.
But that's why I ask you about inflation, because you say that's the real life circumstance for workers out there. So therefore, if you're not going to give them the inflationary rate, it's almost meaningless, isn't it?
Well, it's not meaningless at all, but equally that's not what I'm saying. Of course, the inflationary position is one of the reasons why the public sector pay cap is unsustainable now. I know that.
And
let
the
me
Scottish
finish the
Police
point.
Authority is still talking about a 1% pay rise for their officers.
Well, remember, some public bodies will still be discussing pay in this financial year. We're talking about lifting that cap for the next financial year. Now, remember, I know public sector unions have never supported the pay cap. It was there to try to protect jobs and investment in our public services. But at a time of rising inflation, that's unsustainable.
Are you prepared to put up taxes to help pay for it in Scotland?
We've said we need to have
But are you prepared to do that if it's required?
If I wasn't prepared to think about these things, I wouldn't have said we need to have a debate about them. That's kind of logical. But we'll set out our tax decisions when we publish our budget. Again, that's the normal and sensible course of doing things. But we are in an age when we face, unfortunately, further austerity from the Westminster government. The implications of Brexit are looming, changing demographics. We need to have a debate and a consideration of how we use tax powers progressively and responsibly.